I was standing in my front yard when I noticed the certified letter sticking out of my mailbox, and something told me this wasn't going to be good news. My name is Patrick O'Brien, and I'd been living in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision in Austin, Texas, for about 8 months. The house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch-style home with a decent-sized yard, and I'd spent the last 3 months transforming my front lawn from the typical boring grass monoculture into something actually beneficial for the local ecosystem. Native Texas wildflowers, grasses, and shrubs had replaced the water-guzzling St. Augustine grass that every other house on the block maintained with an almost religious fervor. I pulled the letter from the mailbox and saw the return address: Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. My stomach dropped. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like it was weighted down with bureaucratic nonsense and petty complaints. Inside was a 3-page letter, printed on official-looking letterhead with way too many fonts. The gist of it was simple: remove all the native plants from my front yard within 30 days or face daily fines of $200. The letter was signed by Patricia Whitmore, HOA president, and referenced sections of the community covenant that allegedly prohibited what she called wild, unkempt, and unsightly vegetation incompatible with community standards. I read the letter twice, feeling my blood pressure rise with each sentence. The thing was, I'd done my homework before planting anything. I'd specifically checked Texas state law, which had passed the Native Plant Landscaping Act back in 2023. The law explicitly protected homeowners' rights to use native plants in their yards and prevented HOAs from prohibiting them. I had every legal right to grow these plants. My yard wasn't even messy. I'd carefully designed it with help from a local native plant specialist. There were sections of purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, native grasses like city oats grama and little bluestem, Texas lantana, and even some bluebonnets that I was hoping would really take off in the spring. Everything was mulched, with clear walking paths, and looked far more intentional than the patchy, chemical-dependent lawns most of my neighbors struggled to maintain through Texas summers. I pulled out my phone and took photos of the letter, then went inside to my home office. I'd kept all my research in a folder on my desk, including printed copies of the Texas Native Plant Landscaping Act. I spent an hour drafting a response letter, citing the specific statute that protected my right to native landscaping. I kept it professional but firm, explaining that my landscaping complied with state law and that the HOA's attempt to prohibit it was legally unenforceable. I mailed the letter the next day, certified mail with return receipt. Then I waited. 2 weeks passed without a response. I started to think maybe that would be the end of it. Patricia Whitmore would check with whatever lawyer the HOA kept on retainer. They'd confirm I was right, and everyone would move on with their lives. I should have known better. On a Tuesday morning, I was working from home when my doorbell rang. I worked in software development, which meant most days I could stay in my pajamas until noon if I wanted. I was on a video call when the bell rang, so I muted myself and went to check who it was. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in her late 40s with that particular haircut. You know the one. The "I'd like to speak to the manager" cut, blonde with chunky highlights, styled with enough hairspray to survive a hurricane. She was wearing a white blazer over a floral print dress and holding a leather portfolio like it was a weapon. I opened the door. "Can I help you, Patrick O'Brien?" Her voice was sharp, clipped. "That's me. I'm Patricia Whitmore, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I think you know why I'm here." I leaned against the doorframe. "I got your letter. I sent you a response explaining that my landscaping is protected under state law." Her face tightened. "I don't care what you think some law says. Your yard is a disgrace to this neighborhood. It looks like an abandoned lot. My property values are being affected by your negligence." "It's not negligence, it's native landscaping. Everything out there is native to Texas. It supports pollinators, uses less water, requires no chemical fertilizers or pesticides, and is explicitly protected by Texas state law. That's not what our covenant says." She opened her portfolio and pulled out a highlighted document. Section 12, Paragraph 4 clearly states that all front yards must be maintained with traditional turf grass or approved ground cover. Your weeds don't qualify. They're not weeds, they're native plants, and your covenant can't override state law. Patricia's face was turning red now. "Young man, I have been president of this HOA for 6 years. I know what our rights are. If you don't remove those plants within the original 30-day deadline, which expires in 2 weeks, you will be fined $200 per day. Those fines will continue until compliance is achieved, and if they go unpaid, we can place a lien on your property." I felt my jaw clench. "You're welcome to try. I'll see you in court." "Oh, you will definitely see me in court if you don't comply." She snapped her portfolio shut. 2 weeks, Mr. O'Brien. I suggest you hire a landscaping company to restore your yard to an acceptable condition." She turned on her heel and walked back to her car, a white Mercedes SUV that probably got about 12 miles per gallon. I watched her drive away, then closed the door and returned to my video call. "Sorry about that," I said, unmuting myself. "HOA drama," my coworker Mike laughed. "Dude, that's why I'll never buy in an HOA neighborhood. Those people are insane." "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out." After work, I called my friend James, who was a real estate attorney. We'd gone to college together at UT Austin and had stayed close over the years. "James, I need some advice about HOA law." "Oh no. What did you do?" I explained the situation. James listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I appreciated about him as a lawyer. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Okay, so the good news is you're absolutely right. The Texas Native Plant Landscaping Act specifically prohibits HOAs from banning native plants. The bad news is that doesn't mean they won't try to fine you anyway." "Can they do that?" "They can try. Whether it's enforceable is another question. If they actually fine you and you refuse to pay, they'd have to take you to court to collect or place a lien. At that point, you'd raise the state law as a defense and you'd win, but it's still a hassle." "So what should I do?" "Document everything. Take photos of your yard showing it's well maintained. Keep copies of all correspondence. If they fine you, don't pay, but respond in writing each time explaining why the fines are invalid under state law. If they sue, I can represent you. Honestly, it would be a slam dunk case, and you could probably countersue for attorney fees and harassment." That's what I was hoping you'd say. Just be prepared for them to make your life difficult in the meantime. HOA boards on a power trip can be really petty. He wasn't wrong. The 30-day deadline came and went. The next day, I received another certified letter informing me that I was being fined $200 per day, starting immediately. The letter included an invoice for $200, due within 10 days. I drafted another response, again citing the state law and explaining that I would not be paying any fines related to my legally protected native landscaping. I sent it certified mail. Then things got weird. I started getting violation notices for other things. My trash cans were supposedly visible from the street, even though I kept them in the same place they'd always been, behind a fence on the side of my house. I got a violation for having a vehicle parked in my driveway for more than 72 consecutive hours, referring to my truck that I drove every day. I got a violation for having window coverings that were the wrong color, even though my blinds were the same beige as everyone else's. It was obvious what Patricia was doing. She was trying to bury me in paperwork and fines, hoping I'd either give up on the native plants or just move out of the neighborhood entirely. I responded to each violation notice in writing, with photographic evidence showing that I wasn't actually violating anything. I kept copies of everything in a rapidly expanding file folder. 2 months after the original letter, I was up to over $12,000 in alleged fines, all related to the native plants. Patricia had also started showing up at my house unannounced, sometimes with other HOA board members, demanding to inspect my property. I refused to let them in, which only made her angrier. One Saturday morning, I was outside watering some of the plants that needed establishment care when a pickup truck pulled up. 2 guys got out, wearing uniforms from a landscaping company. "Patrick O'Brien," one of them called out. "Yeah. We're here to remove the vegetation from your front yard. We were hired by the HOA. I walked over to them. "Did the HOA tell you they don't have permission to touch my property?" The guy looked confused. "They said they had the right to bring the property into compliance." "They don't. This is my property, and I haven't authorized any work. If you touch anything, I'll call the police and report it as property damage and trespassing." The 2 guys looked at each other. The one who'd been doing the talking pulled out his phone and walked away, clearly calling someone. I could hear him having a heated conversation. After a few minutes, he came back. "Our boss says we're supposed to do the work. The HOA has the authority according to their covenant." "Your boss is wrong. The HOA covenant can't override state law, and Texas law protects my right to have these plants. I'm telling you clearly, if you touch my plants, I will call the police and press charges. I will also sue your company for property damage." That seemed to get through to them. They got back in their truck and left. I immediately called James. "They tried to send landscapers to tear out my plants. Without your permission. That's trespassing and destruction of property. Did they actually do anything?" "No, I stopped them, but this is getting out of hand." "Okay, I think it's time to go on the offensive. Let me draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA, and we'll also send a letter to their management company if they have one. We'll put them on notice that any further harassment or attempts to damage your property will result in legal action." "Do it." James's letter went out 3 days later. It was beautifully written, laying out exactly how the HOA was violating state law and threatening legal action if the harassment continued. He sent copies to Patricia Whitmore, the HOA's management company, and all the other board members whose names we could find in the community records. The response was immediate, but not in the way I'd hoped. That evening, I found a note taped to my front door. It was handwritten, not on any official letterhead, and the message was short. "You're not welcome here. Leave before we make you." I took a photo of the note and texted it to James. His response was immediate. "Call the police. File a report. This is threatening." I called the Austin Police Department non-emergency line and explained the situation. An officer came out about an hour later. He was in his early 30s, built like he spent a lot of time at the gym, with a no-nonsense demeanor. "So you're having problems with your HOA?" he asked, taking notes. I explained everything from the beginning. The native plants, the fines, the harassment, and now the threatening note. "You know who wrote it?" "I assume it's someone from the HOA board, but I can't prove it. No one signed it." He examined the note, which I'd left taped to the door. "We can take it for evidence, but without knowing who wrote it, there's not much we can investigate. I'll file a report and you'll have a case number. If anything else happens, call us immediately. And if anyone tries to damage your property, call 911 right away. Thanks, officer. After he left, I realized my hands were shaking. This had escalated from annoying to actually scary. Someone was angry enough to leave threatening notes on my door in the middle of the night. I installed security cameras the next day. Front door, back door, and several covering different angles of the yard. They were connected to my phone, with motion alerts and cloud storage. If anyone came near my property, I'd have video evidence. The cameras proved to be a smart investment. 3 nights later, around 2 in the morning, my phone started buzzing with motion alerts. I grabbed it and pulled up the camera app. 3 people were in my front yard, wearing dark clothes and using flashlights. They had bottles of something and were spraying my plants. I called 911 immediately. There are people in my yard destroying my property right now. I have them on camera. The dispatcher took my information and said officers were on the way. I watched through the cameras as the 3 people moved systematically through my yard, spraying bottle after bottle of what I assumed was herbicide on my plants. They worked quickly, clearly trying to do as much damage as possible before anyone noticed. Police sirens became audible after about 5 minutes. The 3 people in my yard heard them too and started running. 2 of them made it to a car parked on the street and drove off, but the third one, clearly panicking, ran the wrong direction and ended up cornered in my backyard when 2 police cruisers arrived. I went outside, my heart pounding. The officers had already detained the person from my backyard and were walking them around to the front. In the porch light, I could see who it was, Patricia Whitmore. She was wearing black yoga pants and a dark hoodie, her signature blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her hands were cuffed behind her back and she was shouting, "This is ridiculous. I'm the HOA president. I have every right to enforce our community standards." One of the officers, a woman with her hair in a tight bun, was not impressed. "Madam, you were caught on camera trespassing on private property and destroying vegetation. You have no legal right to be here." "Those aren't vegetation, they're weeds. This yard is a disgrace." The officer turned to me. "Sir, are you the homeowner?" "Yes, Patrick O'Brien." "I'm the one who called. Can you tell me what happened?" I explained about the motion alerts and watching 3 people spray my plants with what appeared to be herbicide. I pulled up the footage on my phone and showed it to both officers. "That's clear evidence," the male officer said. "Madam, you're under arrest for criminal trespass and criminal mischief. You have the right to remain silent." Patricia's face went from red to purple. "You can't arrest me. Do you know who I am?" "My husband is a lawyer. I'll have your badges for this." The officers were unmoved. They finished reading her rights and put her in the back of one of the cruisers. The female officer came back to talk to me. "You know who the other 2 people were?" "No, I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I have video of their car. Let me pull it up." I found the footage showing the car and its license plate. The officer took down the information. "We'll follow up on that. In the meantime, you should document all the damage to your property. Take photos in the daylight. You'll need that for the criminal case and probably for any civil suit." "Thank you, officers." After they left, I couldn't get back to sleep. I sat on my couch, periodically checking the security camera feeds until the sun came up. As soon as it was light enough, I went outside to assess the damage. It was bad. Most of my plants had been thoroughly doused with herbicide. I could see the spray patterns on the leaves and smell the chemical stench. Some plants might survive, but a lot of them were going to die. I'd invested probably $3,000 in plants and materials, plus countless hours of work. I took extensive photos from every angle, then called James. "You're not going to believe what happened." I told him about the overnight raid and Patricia's arrest. He was silent for a moment, then started laughing. She actually did it. She actually committed crimes on camera. This is perfect. Perfect? James, she killed most of my plants. I know, and I'm sorry about that. But from a legal standpoint, this is the best thing that could have happened. She's facing criminal charges. You have ironclad evidence. We can now file a civil suit against her personally and against the HOA for harassment, trespassing, property damage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Plus, we can use the criminal case to support everything. You're going to win, Patrick, and it's not even going to be close. He was right, but I was still angry about my plants. Over the next few days, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Apparently, Patricia's arrest had become the talk of Meadowbrook Estates. Some people were shocked. Others were quietly pleased, because Patricia had apparently made enemies during her years as HOA president. I got a visit from my next-door neighbor, an older man named Richard who'd always been friendly but had kept his distance from the HOA drama. "I heard what happened," he said. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Patricia's been a problem for a long time, but none of us had the guts to stand up to her. What you did with your yard, using native plants, it's actually really nice. My wife and I have been talking about doing the same thing." "Thanks, Richard. I appreciate that. If you need any help replacing the plants she killed, let me know. I'm retired, I've got time." It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. The police investigation moved quickly. They tracked down the other two people who'd been in my yard. One was Patricia's husband, Gregory Whitmore, who was indeed a lawyer, though apparently not a criminal lawyer because he immediately hired separate counsel for himself. The other was a guy named Todd Miller, who lived 3 streets over and was on the HOA board. All 3 were charged with criminal trespass and criminal mischief. Because the damage exceeded $2,000, it was bumped up to a felony-level charge. James filed the civil suit 2 weeks later. We sued Patricia Whitmore, Gregory Whitmore, Todd Miller, and the Meadowbrook Estates HOA itself. The complaint was extensive, detailing months of harassment, illegal fines, multiple instances of trespass, and finally the deliberate destruction of property. We asked for actual damages, punitive damages, and attorney fees. The HOA's insurance company got involved immediately. They sent their own lawyer to assess the situation. And after reviewing all the evidence, including security camera footage and my documented communications, they apparently had a come-to-Jesus meeting with what remained of the HOA board. I got a call from a lawyer I'd never heard of, someone named Rebecca Chen, who represented the HOA's insurance carrier. "Mr. O'Brien, I've been brought in to handle this matter on behalf of the HOA. I've reviewed the evidence in this case, and I want to be direct with you. The HOA's position is indefensible. What happened to you should never have occurred, and my clients want to resolve this as quickly as possible. I'm listening. We'd like to make you a settlement offer. Full reimbursement for all plants and materials destroyed, compensation for your time and labor, all of your attorney fees, and a formal apology from the HOA board. In addition, the HOA will amend its covenant to explicitly allow native plant landscaping in compliance with Texas state law. Patricia Whitmore has already been removed as president and from the board entirely. What about the criminal charges? Those are separate, and we have no control over them. The district attorney's office will handle that independently. I told her I'd discuss it with my attorney. James and I talked it over that evening. It's a decent offer, he said. We could probably get more if we go to trial, especially punitive damages. But trials take time and energy, and there's always some risk, even when you're in the right. What do you want to do? I thought about it. What I really want is for this to be over. I want my yard back the way it was. I want the HOA to leave me alone, and I want to make sure they can't do this to anyone else. Then, I'd say take the settlement, with some modifications. We'll ask for a higher amount for pain and suffering, given the months of harassment and the threatening note. And we'll require that the HOA include educational materials about native landscaping benefits when they send out the covenant amendment, so people understand why it matters. We countered with those terms. The insurance company agreed within 48 hours. The total settlement was $35,000, which covered my damages, time, stress, and attorney fees, plus the HOA's commitment to change their rules. The criminal case took longer. Patricia, Gregory, and Todd all tried to fight the charges initially, but the video evidence was too clear. The district attorney offered them a plea deal. Plead guilty to misdemeanor criminal mischief, pay restitution, perform community service, and have no contact with me for 5 years. If they rejected the deal and went to trial on the felony charges, they'd likely be convicted and face much harsher penalties. Patricia held out the longest, apparently convinced that her connections and her husband's legal knowledge would save her. But Gregory and Todd both took the plea after their lawyers made it clear they had no defense. Eventually, Patricia's attorney convinced her to take the deal too. Each of them ended up paying me $4,000 in criminal restitution, performing 100 hours of community service, and being on probation for 2 years. Patricia also lost her position on multiple civic boards and volunteer organizations around Austin. Turns out people don't want someone with a criminal record representing their charity. With the settlement money and restitution, I hired the native plant specialist who'd helped me design the original yard to restore everything. We actually improved on the initial design, adding more variety and creating even better pollinator habitat. The work took about 6 weeks, and by the time it was done in early spring, my yard was more beautiful than ever. The bluebonnets came in spectacularly that April. My entire front yard was a sea of blue and purple, mixed with the red of Indian paintbrush and the yellow of coreopsis. People started stopping their cars to take photos. I'd be working in my home office and see families walking by slowly, pointing out the butterflies and bees that covered the flowers. Richard and his wife did end up converting their yard to native plants too. So did 3 other families on my street. It started a small trend in Meadowbrook Estates. The new HOA board, thoroughly chastened by the lawsuit and the bad publicity, sent out the amended covenant along with a 2-page educational sheet about the benefits of native landscaping that James and I had worked on together. The sheet explained how native plants support local ecosystems, reduce water usage by up to 70% compared to traditional lawns, eliminate the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and provide habitat for pollinators that are crucial for food production. It also noted that native landscaping can increase property values by making neighborhoods more attractive and environmentally sustainable. 6 months after the settlement, I was outside deadheading some coneflowers when a woman I didn't recognize walked up my driveway. She was in her 30s, professionally dressed, carrying a tablet. "Patrick O'Brien?" she asked. My guard went up immediately. "Yes. I'm Deanna Torres from the Austin American-Statesman. I'm writing a feature story about native plant landscaping and HOA conflicts in Texas. Your case came up in my research, and I was hoping you'd be willing to talk about your experience." I hesitated. I don't know if I want to relive all that. I understand, but I think your story could help other people who are facing similar situations. A lot of homeowners don't know about the state law that protects native landscaping, If they hear about what happened to you and how you stood up for your rights, it might encourage them to do the same. She had a point. Okay, but I want to see the article before it's published. I can't let you edit it, but I can fact-check it with you and make sure I got everything accurate. We sat on my porch for over an hour. I told her the whole story, from the first threatening letter to the midnight raid to the final settlement. She took notes and photos of my yard. The article came out 2 weeks later, on the front page of the Home and Garden section. It was titled, "One Man's Fight for Native Plants Exposes HOA Overreach." Deanna had done a great job telling the story while also weaving in information about Texas native plant laws, the environmental benefits of native landscaping, and interviews with horticulture experts and legal scholars. The article included a sidebar about the Texas Native Plant Landscaping Act, explaining exactly what it protected and how homeowners could assert their rights. There was also a quote from James about what to do if your HOA tried to prohibit native plants. The response was overwhelming. I got emails and messages from people all over Texas who were dealing with similar HOA conflicts. Some were just starting the process of converting their yards and wanted advice. Others were already in disputes and wanted to know how I'd handled it. I started putting together a guide, basically a step-by-step manual for Texas homeowners who wanted to use native plants in HOA neighborhoods. It covered researching the law, documenting everything, communicating with your HOA, and escalating to legal action if necessary. James reviewed it to make sure all the legal information was accurate. I posted it online for free, and within a month, it had been downloaded over 10,000 times. A state representative reached out and asked if she could use it as supporting material for a bill she was introducing to strengthen protections for native plant landscaping and impose penalties on HOAs that violated state law. Meanwhile, life in Meadowbrook Estates had gotten much quieter. The new HOA president was a younger guy named Marcus who worked in environmental science. He was actually enthusiastic about native landscaping and had started a neighborhood committee to promote sustainable practices. Patricia Whitmore moved away about 8 months after her conviction. Rumor was that she and Gregory got divorced, which I felt a little bad about, but not that bad considering she tried to destroy my property and left threatening notes on my door. I ran into Todd Miller once at the grocery store. He saw me in the produce section and immediately turned around and went the other way. I didn't bother following him. As far as I was concerned, he'd paid his debt through the legal system, and I had no interest in any further interaction. A year after the whole ordeal started, I was sitting on my porch on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and watching a hummingbird work through the red salvia I'd planted. My phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something made me answer it. "Hello. Hi, is this Patrick O'Brien?" The Patrick O'Brien who had the native plant case in Austin. "Yes. Who's this?" "My name is Carlos Mendoza. I'm a producer for a podcast called Property Lines that covers housing issues and HOA conflicts. We'd love to have you on as a guest to talk about your experience." I'd never heard of the podcast, but I looked it up while he was talking. It had decent reviews and seemed legitimate. What would it involve? Just a conversation, probably about 45 minutes. We can do it over video call so you don't have to go anywhere. We'd talk about what happened, the legal issues involved, and what you learned from the experience. We like to feature stories that might help other people navigate similar situations. I agreed. The podcast interview happened 2 weeks later and was actually kind of fun. Carlos was a good interviewer who'd clearly done his research. He asked thoughtful questions and let me fully explain the situation without constantly interrupting. That episode of Property Lines ended up being one of their most downloaded. I started getting recognized occasionally around Austin. Nothing crazy, just people who'd say, "Hey, aren't you the native plant guy?" It was weird but not unpleasant. The most satisfying moment came about 18 months after everything started. I was at a native plant sale at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, looking at some new varieties I wanted to try when a woman approached me. "Excuse me, are you Patrick O'Brien?" "Yes. I just wanted to thank you. I live in an HOA neighborhood in San Antonio, and our board tried to stop me from using native plants last year. I showed them your story and the guide you wrote, and they backed down immediately. My yard is beautiful now, and I've got 4 neighbors who have done the same thing. You really made a difference." That was when I realized this whole nightmare had actually turned into something positive. What started as Patricia Whitmore's petty power trip had become a catalyst for change, not just in my neighborhood but across Texas. My yard continued to thrive. The second spring was even better than the first. I'd learned more about seasonal planning, so I had something blooming from February through November. The butterfly population in my yard was incredible. I counted at least 15 different species, including some monarchs that stopped during their migration. I also started volunteering with a local native plant society, giving talks about my experience and helping other people design their yards. It was satisfying work, and I met a lot of interesting people who cared about the same things I did. One of those people was a woman named Emily who worked as a landscape designer specializing in native plants. We started talking after one of my presentations, discovered we had a lot in common beyond just plants, and started dating. She loved my yard, which was a definite point in her favor. The Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, meanwhile, had become something of a model for how to do things right. Marcus, the new president, had completely restructured how the board operated. They were transparent about finances, actually listened to homeowner concerns, and focused on things that mattered, like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events, rather than obsessing over everyone's lawn. They started an annual garden tour event where people could showcase their yards, and native plant gardens were featured prominently. It brought the community together in a way that Patricia's aggressive enforcement never had. I occasionally thought about Patricia and wondered how she was doing. Not because I cared about her specifically, but because the whole experience had taught me something about how people get twisted up in power and rules for their own sake. Patricia had probably started out wanting to maintain a nice neighborhood, but somewhere along the way, it had become about control and ego rather than community. The irony was that by trying to force conformity, she destroyed the very thing she claimed to care about. The neighborhood was nicer now, more cohesive and friendly than it had ever been under her leadership. 2 years after the incident, I gave a talk at a statewide conference on native landscaping and HOA law. There were about 200 people in the audience, including homeowners, landscapers, lawyers, and even some HOA board members who wanted to understand how to avoid conflicts. I told my story again, but I also tried to focus on practical solutions. How HOAs and homeowners can work together instead of fighting. How native landscaping benefits everyone in a community, not just individual property owners. How Texas's water challenges make native plants not just an aesthetic choice, but an environmental necessity. After the talk, dozens of people came up to ask questions or share their own stories. A few were dealing with HOA conflicts and wanted advice. Others had already successfully converted their yards and wanted to share their experiences. One man told me he'd been on an HOA board that had tried to prohibit native plants until he read my guide and realized they were violating state law. He'd convinced his board to change their rules proactively, avoiding any conflict. That was the outcome I'd hoped for when I first posted the guide online. Every HOA that changed its rules voluntarily was one less homeowner who'd have to go through what I'd experienced. Emily came with me to the conference, and on the drive back to Austin, she said something that stuck with me. "You know what's interesting about your story? You never wanted to be an activist or a spokesperson. You just wanted to grow some native plants in your yard. But sometimes standing up for something small and personal ends up mattering in bigger ways than you expect." She was right. I just wanted a yard that made sense for Texas, that didn't require constant watering and chemical applications, that would support the birds and butterflies and bees that make our world work. I'd never intended to take on an HOA or become the face of a movement. But Patricia Whitmore's aggressive overreach had forced me into a position where I had to fight or give up something I believed in. I'd chosen to fight, and in doing so, I'd accidentally made it easier for thousands of other people to do what I'd done. 3 years after the original conflict, I was working in my yard on a Saturday afternoon when a car pulled up and a young couple got out. They looked nervous. "Hi," the woman said. "I'm sorry to bother you, but we just bought a house in an HOA neighborhood in Round Rock, and we want to use native plants. We've read about your case and your guide, but we were wondering if we could see your yard in person, just to get ideas." I showed them around, explaining what I'd planted and why, pointing out the different blooming seasons and the specific plants that attracted different pollinators. They took notes and photos and asked thoughtful questions. "This is amazing," the man said. "I can't believe your HOA tried to make you tear all this out." "Different people have different ideas about what looks good," I said. "But mostly, I think it was about control. The president at the time couldn't handle someone doing something she didn't approve." "Well, we're going to do this at our place. And if our HOA has a problem with it, we know exactly what to do." They weren't the first people to visit my yard, and they wouldn't be the last. I'd started to think of it as an unofficial demonstration garden. If it helped people feel confident about using native plants, that was worth the occasional interruption. The Texas legislature did end up passing that stronger native plant protection law that the state representative had mentioned. It included specific penalties for HOAs that violated it, provisions for homeowners to recover attorney fees, and requirements that all HOAs in Texas include information about native plant rights in their annual mailings to residents. James had been involved in drafting the legislation, and he'd asked me to testify at a committee hearing. I'd been nervous about speaking in front of legislators, but it had actually gone well. I just told my story, showed pictures of my yard, and explained why the law mattered. Several representatives thanked me afterward and said my testimony had been helpful. When the bill passed and the governor signed it, I got a call from the representative who'd sponsored it. "Patrick, I wanted you to know that this wouldn't have happened without your case. You gave us a real-world example of why these protections matter. Thank you for standing your ground. I'm just glad something good came out of it." 4 years after everything started, Meadowbrook Estates had over 40 homes with native plant landscaping, including 3 on my street. The neighborhood had been featured in a couple of magazines as an example of sustainable suburban development. Property values had actually gone up, not down, contrary to Patricia's predictions. I ran into Richard one evening while we were both out watering. "Even native plants need some supplemental water during establishment and extreme drought. You know," he said, "I never thanked you properly for what you did. Standing up to Patricia like that, you made this whole neighborhood better." "You already thanked me," I said. Like 3 years ago. I know, but I'm thanking you again. My grandkids come over and love looking at all the butterflies in our yard. They're learning about native plants and ecosystems. That wouldn't have happened if you'd just given in and replanted grass. That night, sitting on my porch with Emily, watching the fireflies emerge as the sun set, I reflected on how strange the whole journey had been. 4 years ago, I'd just been a software developer who wanted a lower maintenance yard. I'd had no interest in HOA politics, or environmental activism, or public speaking. But Patricia Whitmore's decision to turn my landscaping choices into a battle had changed the trajectory of my life in ways I never could have predicted. I'd learned about plant ecology and state law and the court system. I'd become a reluctant expert on HOA conflicts. I'd met people I never would have otherwise met, including Emily. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the right thing to do is just stand your ground, even when people with perceived authority tell you you're wrong. Sometimes refusing to back down from a petty bully has consequences that ripple out far beyond the original conflict. My phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from someone in Dallas who just received a violation notice from their HOA about native plants and wanted advice. I'd answer it tomorrow, I decided. Tonight, I just wanted to sit with Emily and watch my yard come alive with the creatures that called it home. The native plants swayed gently in the evening breeze, stems strong and roots deep in Texas soil, exactly where they belonged. Patricia Whitmore had tried to tear them out, had committed crimes to eliminate them, and had failed completely. They'd survived, and they'd thrived, just like I had. Looking back, I wouldn't change anything. Well, maybe I would have installed the security cameras earlier. But the core of it, the decision to plant native species and defend my right to do so, that was worth every moment of stress and conflict. Because it wasn't really about plants, not entirely. It was about whether someone like Patricia Whitmore could use bureaucratic rules to control what other people did on their own property, even when state law said she couldn't. It was about whether HOAs existed to serve their communities or to satisfy the egos of whoever happened to be in charge. The answer to those questions mattered, and I was glad I'd been stubborn enough to fight for the right answers. Emily leaned against my shoulder, and we watched a hawk circle overhead, probably hunting for rodents in the field behind the neighborhood. My yard, with its native plants and lack of rodent poison, was probably helping sustain the hawk's prey population. Everything connected, everything mattered. "What are you thinking about?" Emily asked. "Just how weird life is. 4 years ago, I bought a house and planted some flowers. Now I'm the native plant guy who fought the HOA and won." She laughed. "Could be worse. You could be the guy who gave up and has a boring grass lawn like everyone used to have." "True. This is definitely better." As darkness fell completely and the first stars appeared, I heard the Chuckwell's widow calling from somewhere in the green belt. It was a sound that would have been rare or absent in a traditional suburban neighborhood with its chemical-soaked lawns and lack of insect prey. But here, in this neighborhood that had been transformed partly by accident and partly by necessity, the nightjars returned each spring to hunt in the twilight. Patricia Whitmore had wanted uniformity and control. What she'd gotten instead was a neighborhood full of diverse, beautiful, ecologically functional yards that made people happy and supported the web of life that too many suburbs destroyed. I like to think that was a kind of poetic justice, though I doubted Patricia saw it that way. I hoped she'd found some peace wherever she'd ended up. Not for her sake, really, but because people like her, people who get so wrapped up in rules and power that they lose sight of what actually matters, they're often deeply unhappy. Maybe losing everything had given her a chance to reevaluate what was important, or maybe not. Either way, it was no longer my problem. My problem now was deciding whether to add more milkweed varieties in the back corner, and whether the coral honeysuckle would do better on the fence or the arbor, and whether I should try to propagate some of my more successful plants to share with neighbors. Those were good problems to have. Problems that connected me to the land I lived on, the community I was part of, and the larger web of life that included everything from soil microbes to migrating monarch butterflies. Emily and I eventually went inside, but I paused at the door to look back at my yard one more time. In the darkness, I could barely see the shapes of the plants, but I knew they were there. Native plants growing legally on my property, exactly as Texas law said they could. Patricia Whitmore had demanded I remove them. I'd refused, and I'd won. It was that simple, and that complicated, and I was grateful for every moment of the journey that had brought me here.